I'm glad to welcome you back to the lesson. Today we are going to outline the key components of an ethical policy. Components of an ethical policy. But first of all, what is an ethical policy? An ethical policy is a document that outlines an organization's ethical principles, values, and expectations for behavior. It serves as a guide for employees, managers, and stakeholders in making decisions and conducting business activities in a morally responsible manner. This document has components, and that is what we are going to highlight. Components of an ethical policy. One, an ethical policy has a component on purpose or objectives. Objective and purpose. Now, the objective or purpose component clearly states the purpose of the policy. It states the purpose of the policy. The purpose of the policy. It states the purpose clearly. The purpose of the policy and its importance to the organization and its importance to the organization. At the introduction of the ethical policy, there has to be a section on the objective and purpose. It explains how the policy aligns with the organization's mission. States how the policy aligns with the organization's mission or vision. You understand? That is the objective and purpose, the introduction. The second component is the scope. Scope. Now, the scope defines, this section defines the scope of the policy, specifying who applies to, what applies, who it applies to, say, employees, contractors, board of directors, and so on. You understand? The scope defines the scope of the policy, specifying who it applies to. It defines who it applies to. Does it apply to employees? Does it apply to the management? Does it apply to both employees and management? Does it apply to board members? So the scope applies or defines who it applies to. It also clarifies limitations, the limitations of the policy. The component scope defines the limitations of the policy. First of all, it defines who it applies to, and it outlines also the limitations of the policy. The limitations of the policy. It clarifies any exclusions or limitations of the policy. The third component is the ethical principles. Ethical principles. This is yet another component or element of ethical policy, ethical principles and values. Ethical principles and values. There is an element on ethical principles and values. This section identifies the core ethical principles and values that guide the organization's behavior. You understand? It identifies core ethical principles. It identifies core ethical principles. Principles like honesty, responsibility, accountability, and so on. They may include integrity, respect, environmental sustainability, and so on. And the ethical principles section also explains how these principles and values are applied. Explains how the principles are applied. An ethical policy should have a section on ethical principles and values that explains how the principles and values are applied in practice. Right? How they are applied in various aspects of the organization's operations. 4. Code of conduct. The code of conduct is another component of an ethical policy. Code of conduct, which provides specific guidelines for ethical behavior. Provides specific guidelines for ethical behavior. The code of conduct specifies the guidelines for ethical behavior, provides specific guidelines for ethical behavior. It also addresses issues such as conflict of interest, addresses issues such as conflict of interest, issues such as confidentiality, and so on. The code of conduct addresses issues such as conflict of interest, confidentiality, bribery, harassment, discrimination, corruption, bribery, etc. You understand? Code of ethics. The code of ethics may also give examples of ethical and unethical behavior to illustrate the principles in action. That is number 4. 5 is compliance and reporting mechanisms. Compliance and reporting mechanisms. An ethical policy will have a section on compliance and reporting mechanisms, which outlines the organization's commitment to complying with relevant laws. Outlines organization's commitment. It outlines the company's commitment to comply. Commitment to do what? To comply with relevant laws. Relevant laws, regulations, and procedures. Compliance. All right, it outlines the organization's commitment to comply with relevant laws, with relevant regulations, etc. Now, the section on compliance and reporting also establishes procedures for reporting, ethical issues, reporting violations, etc. It establishes procedures for reporting ethical issues, ethical violations, and so on. It may also explain the consequences of violating the policy, consequences for violating the policy. Compliance and reporting mechanism section also outlines the consequences for violating the policy. Another component of an ethical policy is training and education. 6. Training and education. Training and education. Now, this section describes the organization's commitment to providing ongoing training and education on ethical issues. It explains how employees will be informed about the policy, explains how the employees will be informed about the policy. It explains how the employees will be informed about the policy. It also describes the organization's commitment to providing ongoing training, commitment to providing ongoing training, provides commitment to providing ongoing training to employees. That is training and education. That is the 6th component of an ethical policy. There is also a section on review and revisions. Review and revisions. This is yet another component of ethical policy. Review and revisions, which specify how often the policy will be reviewed. It specifies how often the policy will be reviewed. It specifies how often the policy will be reviewed. It also outlines the process for making changes. Outlines the process of making changes to the policy. It outlines the process of making changes to the policy. That is another component. It outlines the process of making changes to the policy. So these are 7 key components of an ethical policy. We may have other optional components like stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement is an additional component which describes how the organization will engage with stakeholders on ethical issues. Describes how the organization will engage, how the organization will engage with stakeholders on ethical issues. It describes how the organization will engage with stakeholders on ethical issues. That is the stakeholder engagement section. It may also describe the social responsibility. That means outlining the organization's commitment to social responsibility. There could be a section on diversity and inclusion which addresses the organization's commitment to diversity and inclusion in the workplace. There could also be a component on ethical leadership, which emphasizes the role of leadership in setting an ethical tone for the organization, and so on. But the 7 are the key components. These are additional components: stakeholder engagement, diversity and inclusion, ethical leadership. All right, ethical leadership. 10, diversity and inclusion, social responsibility, and so on. Social responsibility. You can go on and on and on. But these 7 are the core components of an ethical policy. Number 1 is the introduction, which outlines the objectives and purpose of the ethical policy. This section has the purpose and the importance of the policy. It states how the policy will align with organization's mission. The second component is the scope, which defines who it applies to. Does it apply to employees? Does it apply to managers? Does it apply to the board of directors? So the scope defines who it applies to. It also outlines the limitations of the policy. These are exclusions. Who are excluded from the policy? It has to be stated under scope. That is the scope. Scope. Then the third component is ethical principles and values. This section identifies the core ethical principles like honesty, respect, fairness, responsibility, accountability, and so on. It further explains how the principles are applied in practice. The fourth component is the code of conduct, which specifies, which outlines the specific guidelines for ethical behavior. Under this section also, it addresses issues such as conflicts of interest, confidentiality, harassment, discrimination, bribery, corruption, and so on. That is the fourth component. The fifth component is on compliance and reporting mechanisms. The policy should outline the company's commitment to comply with relevant laws and regulations. It outlines the procedures for reporting ethical issues and violations. And there also to be description of consequences for violating the policy. Number 6, we have training and education. The policy explains how the employees will be informed about the policy. It highlights the commitment to providing ongoing training that has to be included within the policy. Another section is on reviews and revisions. The policy should specify how often the policy will be reviewed, and it outlines the process of making changes to the policy. The 8th component is stakeholder engagement. We've said that the stakeholder engagement describes how the organization will engage with stakeholders on ethical issues. There is a section on ethical leadership. Ethical leadership, we've said that ethical leadership emphasizes the role of leadership in setting an ethical tone for the organization. There is a section on diversity and inclusion, which addresses the organization's commitment to diversity and inclusion in the workplace. There is the aspect of social responsibility, which outlines the organization's commitment to social and environmental responsibility. So these are 11 components of ethical policy. Here is today's assignment on key components of ethical policy. 1, what are the essential components of an effective ethical policy for a business? 2, How should an ethical policy be communicated and implemented within an organization? 3. What role does training and education play in ensuring adherence to ethical practices or policies? Lastly, 4. How can ethical policies be adapted to address emerging ethical challenges in the business environment? In our next lesson, we're going to study ethical culture. Bye.